Thank you for that generous introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking everybody here at Florida Coastal and everyone who's worked hard to put together this conference. It's an honor to be the opening speaker, and I'm grateful to have been invited here for that purpose. In the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be sharing with you my overall sense of some key ongoing trends and circumstances in government, in the private sector, and also among public opinion, trends that are affecting the prospects for effective protection of the environment and public health. To some extent, my remarks this morning will emphasize what's happening nationally, particularly at the federal level in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and especially within EPA's Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Program. However, my presentation will not be limited to those topics. So to begin, I'll convey what I see as the most germane realities in the law and politics of public health and environmental protection. I'll also try to offer a few tentative predictions about where our field seems to be heading. To my mind, there are several trends that in environment and public health protection that both deserve mention and merit continuing attention. First, I think it's safe to state that collectively, we now know more than ever before about earth science, ecology, how to measure ambient pollution, the effects of pollution on the environment and public health, and how to abate pollution and remediate contamination. Over the past 4 or 5 decades, the scientific community has really made enormous strides in understanding how the environment works, how human activity has disrupted natural patterns, how environmental contamination has an impact on human health, and how to mitigate or abate environmental harm. However, as much as we do now know, I believe there is a great deal that collectively we still do not know about the state of our environment. Let me cite one domestic example of a gap in our knowledge. According to EPA, the states and the federal government combined have only monitored 39% of our nation's lakes and reservoirs, 29% of our bays and estuaries, and a mere 16% of our rivers and streams. This means that we simply don't know the quality of the vast majority of the nation's surface waters. In fact, that fact seems especially significant when one takes account of the fact that approximately 66% of the population of the United States gets its drinking water from surface water sources. A third ongoing phenomenon is that the general public in our country is in need of a good deal more objective, factual information than they typically are exposed to regarding the environmental and public health challenges that we all face. To use climate disruption as an illustration, most of the information that the public receives about this very important topic comes from only one of 2 sources: the news media and advertising on television. Regrettably, in the recent past, many journalists have tended to give equal coverage to scientists who believe that global climate is generally warming as a result of human activity, and to individuals who deny that the planet is getting warmer, or else believe that global climate change is unrelated to a human-generated greenhouse effect. This has been true, notwithstanding the fact that fully 97% of the world's climate scientists have long since concluded that the Earth is indeed warming, and warming rather rapidly, that the cause of global warming is human emissions of CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases, and that the warming of our planet has already begun to cause among other consequences, sea level rise, extreme weather conditions, including flooding and drought, and increased levels of waterborne or vector-borne human diseases. With regard to television advertising, unfortunately, most of what the public is routinely exposed to is simply self-interested happy talk. Most TV ads concerning energy issues make no mention whatsoever of the risks posed by climate change. We hear a lot on television about clean coal, clean natural gas, and so forth, but the commercials provide us with no specifics about how combustion of fossil fuels will affect our environment, or how fossil fuel burning compares with renewable energy sources in its impact. Notwithstanding the paucity of pertinent, readily available information, however, recent public opinion polls have revealed quite significant increases in concern among the US public regarding disruption of global climate. Thus, for example, a random poll conducted last month by Stanford University and Resources for the Future, a nonpartisan environmental research organization, found that approximately two-thirds of the more than 1,000 people surveyed indicated that they agreed that, quote, global warming has been happening and we need to stop the damage. It's time to use new forms of domestic renewable energy and to manufacture cars and appliances that use less gas and electricity. Two-thirds of those who were surveyed agreed with that statement, and those who concurred in that proposition included 66% of political independents, and interestingly, 48% of Republicans, along with 81% of the Democrats who responded to the survey. At the same time, the same poll indicated that only 13% of all those who responded believed that, quote, global warming is a hoax and fraud, and only 27% think that, quote, proposals to deal with climate change all hurt the economy and increase domestic unemployment. Another circumstance worth noting is that even though federal environmental laws and their implementation have led to very considerable progress in protecting public health and the environment, those laws need to be updated to address some long-standing problems and to focus on newer problems that were only recognized after the laws were passed. Most of our modern federal environmental laws were first enacted in the early 1970s or the 1980s, and they were subsequently amended, in most cases once, in a few cases twice. A good many of those laws were passed in response to a sustained public outcry that was based on a widespread perception of an environmental crisis. A sustained public clamor for the passage of strong federal laws to protect the environment and public health was spurred by a number of well-publicized environmental problems and disasters. Among those were recurring smog incidents in Los Angeles beginning in the early 1950s, the 1969 blowout of an offshore oil drilling operation in Santa Barbara, California, the Niagara Falls, New York Love Canal disaster in 1978, the massive methyl isocyanate release in 1984 in Bhopal, India, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989. The federal environmental legislation that resulted from public demands included the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA, Superfund, the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and the Oil Pollution Act, among other federal environmental laws. There is very considerable evidence that those laws led to a great deal of environmental cleanup and health protection. Under the Clean Air Act, for example, there have been reported significant decreases in detected outdoor levels of lead, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, breathable particulate matter, and other air pollutants. And those improvements in turn have resulted in improvements in public health and environmental quality. Similarly, as a result of the Clean Water Act, reports of the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality have noted very large improvements in water quality with regard to a number of what were then common water pollutants. They include BOD and COD waste, fecal coliform bacteria, and also overall declines in levels of discharges of lead and phenol. There is now much less haphazard disposal of hazardous waste than was true before the Superfund was passed in 1980 and before EPA established regulations requiring the safe handling and disposal of hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act in the early 1980s. And other meaningful improvements in health-related environmental conditions have also taken place. This is, of course, all good news. At the same time, however, as useful and beneficial as they have been, our environmental laws contain a number of important omissions. For example, the Clean Water Act has always given short shrift to the environmental damage caused by so-called non-point source runoff from agricultural operations. Several harmful pollutants are frequently contained in the unchanneled waste stream that washes off of croplands, and those include nitrates, phosphates, sodium, chlorides, and sediments, as well as a number of very toxic herbicides and pesticides. The U.S. Council on Environmental Quality has reported increases in all of those contaminants, both in surface water and in groundwater. Moreover, with only a few exceptions, the Clean Water Act is simply not designed to protect America's groundwater resources, even though groundwater is a source of drinking water for many millions of people. Another major federal problem not squarely addressed by our federal environmental laws is climate disruption. At the time that the Modern Clean Air Act was passed in 1970 and when it was subsequently amended in 1990, climate change was simply off the radar screen of most scientists, legislators, and public interest advocates. Few saw it as a major danger, and our federal environmental laws just didn't address it directly. Over the past 2 decades, however, scientific understanding of the reasons for climate disruption and the threat that it poses has increased exponentially. After an unsuccessful attempt to persuade Congress to enact comprehensive legislation to address climate change, the Obama administration has begun an effort to make creative use of 2 hitherto fairly obscure provisions of the Clean Air Act to regulate the emission of CO2 from both existing and new power plants that burn fossil fuels. After those regulations are put in final form, they are almost certain to be challenged in court by regulated utility companies in some states. It remains to be seen how they will ultimately fare after judicial review. On a brighter note, an encouraging current trend in environmental and public health protection has been an uptick in the number of private sector firms that now take a responsible and constructive stance on environmental issues. When I worked at EPA a number of years ago, I learned that one can never generalize accurately about the so-called industrial and business community. Private companies really vary greatly. They range from law-abiding, conscientious corporate citizens to firms that take a largely indifferent yet pragmatic approach to meeting environmental obligations to outright corporate scofflaws and environmental criminals. To my knowledge, that extremely diverse pattern within the private sector prevails as much today as it did in the 1970s and the 1980s. However, at the same time, my sense is that more private companies than previously are now aware of environmental and health-related problems and issues, and that set of companies seems genuinely more willing to address those matters than before. I also think that there is far more private technical know-how with regard to pollution control than was true in the past years. These salutary changes have been especially notable recently with regard to corporate attitudes toward climate change. And an ever-increasing number of firms seems now to be recognizing that human-caused climate disruption will harm their business operations. And they are now breaking openly, in some cases, with other private sector entities that deny or unduly minimize the climate change problem. The final trend that I'll mention this morning is more unsettling from the standpoint of public health and the environment. It is that significant shortfalls in personnel and other resources have pervaded EPA and in many cases its state and local counterparts as well. These resource cutbacks have had a noticeably negative effect on the operation of many of those agencies at several levels. From 1992 through 2012, a 20-year period, the total number of EPA employees remained relatively stable. However, throughout that period, the proportion of EPA's budget that the agency could use for any purpose other than paying the salaries of its employees steadily declined. That was because throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Congress often mandated that all federal employees be given set cost of living wage increases. However, Congress neglected to increase the total size of EPA's budget to reflect the fact that all employee salaries were going up. EPA was thus forced to spend an ever greater percentage of its allocated funds on employee salaries and to spend less and less of its appropriated monies for everything else that the agency had to pay for, from travel expenses for field inspectors, to computers, to maintaining buildings, to lab equipment, and so on. On top of these almost publicly invisible budget problems, during the past 3 years, EPA's workforce has declined by more than 10%. That was a result of staff attrition combined with across-the-board hiring freezes. These staff cuts, together with the problems caused by the budget plateaus and employee cost of living adjustments I just adverted to, have now begun to result in some serious impacts on the quantity and the effectiveness of EPA's work in some vital areas. In fact, as the economy has grown, all sources of pollution have similarly grown. Nonetheless, the agency's work output has steadily declined with respect to its responsibilities in several areas. Those include conducting new scientific research, providing revolving fund loans and grants to states and localities, processing applications for permit renewals and new permits, conducting facility compliance inspections, and pursuing enforcement actions. Some similar problems have also arisen in many instances in state and local environmental protection agencies and departments. Beginning in 2007 and 2008, at the start of the long economic downturn from which the United States is still recovering, most U.S. states and localities experienced a rather dramatic drop-off in revenues combined with an increased need to spend public funds to respond to circumstances that stemmed from the Great Recession. As one might perhaps expect, during this period, the budgetary allocations of a large number of state and local environmental agencies declined. Quite a few staff members in those organizations around the country were either laid off or furloughed, and the important environmental protection agency or the environmental protection work, importantly done by these sub-national government agencies, fell off perceptibly. As our nation's economy has gradually begun to improve, and state and local revenue streams have grown. Some of the budget cuts at local and state levels have been restored among environmental agencies. Nonetheless, most of those agencies and departments are smaller in size today than they were before 2007, and depending upon where one looks, in some cases those agencies are very much smaller than they used to be. In the aggregate, these recent trends and developments have had a significant downward effect on what environmental agencies at all levels can do and how much they do. To illustrate, I'll concentrate primarily on what's been happening within EPA's enforcement program. That's a program that I regularly track and am familiar with, but I want to discuss it too because I believe that enforcement and compliance work is a really important aspect of what the EPA does. As I mentioned earlier, privately owned businesses vary immensely in their approach to protecting health and the environment. And they vary in their ability and willingness to comply with environmental laws. Just as there are good corporate citizens, so too there are bad actors who frequently and consistently violate environmental standards, including requirements to protect the public health. Where they are effective and fair, government enforcement programs create incentives for environmental compliance by penalizing those who do not follow the law. Additionally, they establish a level playing field, so to speak, between regulated firms who comply and those who do not. And ultimately, in my view, competent and professional enforcement is necessary to ensure that the public receives the protections and services promised by our laws. I've observed the impact of budget and resource shortfalls on enforcement at EPA in two ways. From candid conversations and comments made to me in private conversations with EPA enforcement personnel around the country, and also from EPA's self-declared goals for its enforcement work over the next several years. In my chats with them, experienced EPA enforcement attorneys and engineers and managers whom I've spoken with have privately told me such things as, quote, "We're really running on fumes right now. I've never seen our resource situation this bad." Quote, "Right now we just don't have enough bodies here to get the job done." And quote, "We simply need more people. That's all there is to it." EPA's enforcement projections, as stated in the agency's formal fiscal year 2014-2018 strategic plan, also provide telling indications of a shrinking EPA enforcement footprint. The agency's plan indicates that through the year 2018, EPA expects to conduct 6,200 fewer enforcement inspections of pollution sources per year than it conducted annually between 2005 and 2009. Similarly, again in comparison to what it did annually between 2005 and 2009, EPA projects that it will initiate 1,100 fewer civil enforcement cases per year, and it will conclude an annual average of nearly 1,100 fewer civil cases than it conducted in 2005 to 2009. EPA also expects that its enforcement actions will result in a reduction of 64 million pounds of water pollution per annum fewer than was annually reduced in the late 2000s through the EPA's enforcement efforts. These will not be insubstantial decreases. The agency's official predictions thus tend to substantiate the more subjective, qualitative statements of the EPA enforcement staff people I communicated with that federal pollution control enforcement is now resource-starved and in decline. Where is this all likely to lead? Well, predicting the future is a most uncertain business. As a prominent economic historian put it, history always makes its own pathways. And that's surely true with respect to environmental health protection. If I had to prognosticate nonetheless, I would say that in most respects we need to simply expect more of the same. I think our collective understanding of the natural world and the human impact on it will continue to expand. Public concern over the risks of climate change and other environmental problems will also continue to grow. I think more and more business people will realize that protecting the environment and human health make good business sense. Simultaneously, however, I predict that domestic environmental quality monitoring and governmental enforcement activity will continue on at their current inadequate levels or else decline even further, especially in the federal government. I'd also surmise that it's like that partisan gridlock is likely to prevent any meaningful modernization of our environmental laws. The one possible exception is the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act. Congress is now considering the possibility of amending that. We'll see how that comes out. One question that I can offer no prediction about is how much and how quickly the American public will come to refocus on environmental problems and demand that their elected representatives improve our environmental laws. I think that the answer to that question will depend in part on just how much the news media decides to focus on environmental and public health issues, and it'll be a function of how much other accurate information the public is able to acquire. I very, very much hope, in closing, I very, very much hope that public understanding of the changing state of our environment will grow at a rapid pace. And in closing, in support of that hopeful potential prospect, I'd like to quote from one of our nation's founding fathers, James Madison, who long ago observed that knowledge is power, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives.